Hey everyone, thank you for tuning into today to another episode of Leading from Afar. I'm Scott Markovitz. Welcome back, Tevi. You were quite missed last week, so it's good to have you back. I hope in the last week you've been able to change some hearts and minds at Envision to embrace async communication, so you're not forced to miss out on future episodes.
Hopefully making progress on that.
Slowly but surely. Maybe before diving into today's topic and doing the introduction, I just wanted to throw an intro question here to both of you, getting your feedback of the recent story on the, I'm going to call it a mutiny at Apple, of the decision of forcing people back into the office 3 days a week. Wanted to get your take on what you think about it before we get going here. JT, you want to get going first?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can start with it. I definitely respect Apple's decision. I would love to see more companies offering a hybrid approach and just giving it a little bit more time to see what productivity levels look like, continuing to gauge employee satisfaction with this hybrid model. But I would love to know what led to that decision. I don't have the facts behind it, but it's an interesting decision, and I'm sure they will continue to evaluate how it goes. But yeah, that was interesting to see from Apple, and I'm interested to see how the rest of companies continue to adapt as we move forward in this new business world.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be interesting to see how they iterate on that. Apple has a very strong in office culture. They spend a lot of money and effort on their buildings and headquarters. So I think it's a strong part of their culture to be in the office. I think that it's a little bit of a nod to the fact that people can be productive remotely, but they still want people in the office. So I think it'll be interesting to see how people enjoy working like that, if there will be set times where everybody is free to work where they want, specific days of the week where they'll have to be in the office versus specific days of the week where they can work from anywhere. And curious to see how.
Yeah, so I'm going the extreme in saying that companies should be taking a very close look at this. They're not the first. The same came from Google and Facebook in the last 2 months that all went with this 3-2 approach. And then within a week, having to pivot their decisions of putting some percentage of employees working full time. I've said across, I don't know how many of these episodes, if there's any one thing that companies should have learned the last year plus is that you're simply not going to force people back into an office ever again, whether that's 3 days, 2 days, 1 day. So companies are really going to need to start thinking how, if they're going hybrid, how you're actually going to be able to do it, because you're just simply not going to get every employee back to the office, whether you want to or not. We could probably spend a whole podcast episode on this. Any company that's exploring the idea of hybrid and what that will look like should be paying close attention. But get us back on track here for this conversation today. So today we're happy to be joined by JT. JT is the director of sales at Roots, which is an HR stack for Slack-centric teams. Prior to Roots, JT has been leading remote sales teams across a few different companies. And JT, usually the way that we start off is tell us a little bit more about yourself and tell us a little bit more about.
Yeah. So I'm JT. I would say I'm somewhat of an HR nerd. I've been in the space for, I actually love it. So that's a backhanded compliment to myself. But I've been in the space for about 12 plus years across several different companies in sales and sales leadership. I find the HR technology space fascinating. There's constant change, there's constant innovation. I've led teams in office, I've led teams remote, I've led teams through a pandemic as well, remote, that had been in an office. At Roots, what I do is lead all sales efforts. And what we do is build HR plugins that meet employees where they rather be, which is in their Slack environment. Plain and simple. So, yeah, excited to be here, excited to talk to you both about remote leadership and one-on-ones. It's a topic that we are passionate about as a company and myself as well.
Very cool. Can you tell us a little bit more about the product itself? How is it helpful to remote teams?
Yeah, so our plugins allow remote teams to have total visibility into items related to PTO, managing that from your Slack environment, one-on-ones, onboarding, referring potential colleagues to the organization, and social connections. seeing how engaged employees are with each other in public channels. Our niche is keeping that all within the Slack environment to eliminate employees having to log into multiple systems to do HR related tasks. So we want to keep them in that tool to allow them to do their best work.
Awesome. As a leader in whatever capacity, whether it's one-on-one feedback or product feedback, things like that, one of the most difficult aspects is eliciting transparent, honest feedback. So from your experience leading remote teams, whether through a pandemic, previous or now, what can leaders do to elicit that feedback from their director?
That's a great question. And I'd love to get both of your thoughts on that as well. But I think setting expectations up that they want feedback from their direct reports. I think a lot of times leaders, they would like feedback, but they don't set that expectation and open that door to receive that feedback. So it's hard for their employees to give it to them. But in my experience, when you set that expectation, you will get the feedback from your employees. And you've got a couple options, right? You can take that feedback and get better, or you cannot and you could totally ignore. But what I've seen is once you give that open door for feedback, your employees will start to see if you've taken that feedback serious, they will start to see a change in the feedback that you've given them. I would say opening the door, saying, hey, I'm here. I need to get better. This is not, I'm just critiquing you. I want to get better as a manager, showing a sense of vulnerability. I think that's one of the best traits you can have in leadership is being vulnerable because we're all human. But I think that simple phrase of setting the expectation that I need feedback as well, and I'm going to give feedback will really help get the feedback that you need as a manager. But I'd like to toss it back to you two and see what your thoughts are as well.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, JT. It's important that you provide, as a leader, you provide the safety for people to give the feedback. So you have to directly request it. Say, how am I doing with this? Or what can we do about that? Be very specific about what you want feedback on. But then make sure that your response to the feedback shows that you appreciate the feedback and that you're respecting the thoughts and ideas. Even if you don't necessarily do what they ask, you still have to provide that safety that it's okay to speak freely. I think that's important. A lot of leaders say they want feedback, but then they might dismiss it as soon as they get it, or they'll make a comment that shows they disagree right away, and they're already shutting it down. What do you think, Scott?
I think have both laid it out perfectly. It's creating that safe environment to be able to give feedback, and as a leader, sharing that honesty yourself, because everything starts with the captain. If you're the one who's sharing honest feedback yourself, you're the one who's giving the right opportunities for them to give feedback. I think that it definitely opens up the responsibility and the opportunity to give feedback. The one thing that I also believe, and maybe I'll end it off with the next question to you, JT, is what you actually do with that feedback. I think it's one thing that you elicit the feedback and they give that feedback to you, but then the real question is, okay, what happens with that feedback? I think it's extremely important of how you structure it, how you make your direct report understand, yes, I've heard it, and here's exactly what you said. Here's a project plan or a to-do plan. This is exactly what I'm planning to do with your feedback. And then keeping them in the loop. And the following meetings is what we've been able to do. Here's what we're not able to do. Because I think that is important. It's what actually happens when I give feedback. Is anything happening with it? And if it is, then it encourages me more to give feedback in the future. But if it goes into a black hole somewhere and the feedback doesn't get anywhere, then it kind of discourages me in the future because nothing is really going to come out of it. So I'll turn that into a question of how do you show your employees you're implementing and taking on board their feedback?
That's a great question, Scott. I think very similar to when you give an employee feedback on a skill set that you need them to get. I think we talked about coaching. I'm passionate about that before the call. You want to come back to those pieces of feedback each and every week, right? I can't tell someone I need them to improve on sales calls during a one-on-one, and then we never talk about it. It's that constant coming back to it. Now, it doesn't need to be tedious and micromanaging every day, every week. So as a manager, you can do that as well. Scott, if you work for me and you give me some feedback, we come back and touch base on that every week. I show you where I'm at. So it's like a little bit of reversing of roles. So the employee kind of feels like their manager, and that's probably not the best analogy, but still they're able to benchmark the feedback that you've given them, that they've given you, and continue to have open conversations, because that's how you can get really good relationships with your employees. It goes back to what I talked about earlier, being vulnerable, and then having those moments where they're able to tell you, this is what I'd like to see you get better at. And it comes off very trusting, right? Because they know you give really good feedback, they give really good feedback, and that's how you can grow and you can get the most out of that employee. Because in my experience, when employees trust you, they'll do whatever it takes. They'll run through a wall for you, but you've got to build that trust. It's not something that can happen in a one-on-one once a month, right? It is constant feedback in a safe environment, positive and negative. And that's how I feel like you can grow that relationship and get the most out of it, which will lead ultimately to higher production, whatever that role is.
Yeah. Tevye, I would love your insight, especially being in a product role, because I think this is very similar to running product. You're always trying to gather feedback from users, that honest feedback, how you like the product, what you don't like, what I think it's the same experience. If you're an end user and you saying, hey, this feature would be great, or this is a pain point for me, and you've seen that improvement in the product, then it enables you and it gives you motivation to keep building on that relationship. But if it's not, then it's like, okay, why should I continue giving my feedback? Teddy, would love your insight from a product perspective.
Yeah, totally. I love the way JT put it, how he shows his progress. I think that's super important in really any feedback, even on a product. As a manager, there should be a feedback loop where you accept the feedback, you show progress on it, and report on it or communicate on it, whoever that may be too. I love that there's a way that if you get feedback from an employee or a team member, I'd love to know what your tools are, JT, actually, because I think that's really cool. Is that something that you could do in Roots?
That is a really good question. I'm pretty old school. I keep a notebook. I come back to notes every one-on-one. I don't want our communication to just simply be during a one. So it's daily check-ins, but not from a micromanagement standpoint. It's, hey, how's it going today?
Right.
Happy birthday to your wife or your spouse or your significant other or your child. Those little things that help build that trust when you do have to deliver tough feedback, they know that you care, right? If the only time you talk to an employee and you have to give them difficult feedback is during a one-on-one, they're going to take it in a way that it wasn't intended to be delivered. But it's those little nuggets each and every day, hopping on calls, right? Like checking in during the day, at the end of the day, knowing little personal details about them. Those are trusting relationships. Those are relationships that you build outside of work too. So you need to have those relationships with your employees and your staff as well. For me, it's pretty old school, I'll be honest, just coming back to previous notes and just being really intentional. Because when you're intentional about things, it's really hard for you to forget. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, you're saying two things. You're saying be authentic in your communication and make sure there's a feedback loop. So that's cool. I actually use Notion. I do something similar. I have a one-on-one document for each person that I meet with. And every week or whenever I speak with them, I'll put in an entry for that date. And if there's an action item, I'll put it at the top of the document. And I'll track it that way. So the next time I speak with them, that action item will be at the top. It'll either be completed or incompleted. And we'll discuss the progress of that.
We actually do have a one-on-one plugin. We do have the ability within Roots to track one-on-ones and what has happened on previous one-on-ones, being able to add talking points to following one-on-ones and being able to go back and see how an employee or manager has graded a one-on-one, giving feedback on that as well.
Cool. How about you, Scott?
Yep. So it's also either through a Notion document or a Google document, depending on the team and what tools they're using. Also, similar type of format every week or whenever the one-on-ones are. You have your agenda, you have your action items, that are things that are left over from last week. But the one thing I really loved, JT, that you said, and I had a big smile on my face, that feedback really comes from those micro interactions every day. How's it going? How's your day? How's your wife? Did your kid make the soccer team? I heard your kid hit the walk-off home run, whatever the scenario is. It's those little micro interactions that build that relationship and that trust between leader and their team. I know my leader has got my back. I know he cares about me. The fact that he's checking in, he's asking about my family, he's asking what's new. He's really making the emphasis for me to grow in my career and whatever else it is. As you said, I'll run through the wall. My first leader that I ever had in work was very much this way. I remember that we had one summer, we were trying to do a project, and I was working 6 days a week, probably 16 hours a day. And it was only for him. I didn't care about the project, any of the deliverables. I knew this guy would do anything for me. So I was like, I'll run through a wall. At one point, I was like super duper sick, and I checked in that day from home. But as you said, when you build that relationship of trust and that bond, it goes a very long way.
I guess talking more specifically about different kinds of feedback, what are some methods that you have with positive reinforcement or positive feedback? At Envision, we use something called Bonusly, which is a nice way to show public recognition and award people in like dollars. You could award someone like $5 for helping out on a project. I never saw that used anywhere else, but it's kind of cool. It's a nice way to build teamwork. Everybody sees what other people are doing and what they're getting rewarded with. What are some ways that you show positive reinforcement and positive?
Great question. I know this may embarrass employees sometimes, but I like to post their accomplishments in public where I know executives are at, or even send emails and copy executives on emails that we've either gotten back from a client. They're really happy with how that employee just interacted with them. Just those little subtle things, right? Because again, it's me showing my staff that I care about them. It's an indirect way to get them in front of executives that know that they do a good job, but they don't know the details. So I try to be really intentional in terms of just making sure that my staff get in front of the people that they need to be from a recognition standpoint. I think that's super important. I was taught that early on in my leadership career, is just those little things go a long way. I would say 9 times out of 10, once the employee figures out that the executives on that correspondence are they get a note and they didn't know that the executive was on there, I get a note back to say that was so awesome. Thank you for doing that. That means a lot. Because I would love to know the stats on this, but I feel like at least in the sales profession, there's a lot more people that do it for the recognition. The money's important, but I can only speak in my experience. The top performers want to be recognized. They also want to be paid, but I would put recognition right above that. So I always try to do it in unique and creative ways. But again, it's one of those things like Scott talked about, when you have a manager or someone that you work for that is passionate about you and your success, the sky's the limit in terms of what that employee can output for you in whatever the role is. It can be sales, marketing, HR, product. I'm just telling you, it's just that emotional piece of it can bring out the best in people.
I love that. I love that idea. And that's something that I also experienced through my first manager. When a project went really well, or one of the internal stakeholders was very happy with something, it's my manager every time would reply back to his manager saying, "Oh, this was handled by Scott. And Scott did a great idea," and CC on this mail. I think that's an absolutely fantastic thing that you could do as a leader. You're not taking responsibility for the work that your team did. You're giving them the credit, saying, "Hey, they did the hard work. They're the ones who deserve the recognition." I absolutely love that. But switching gears from positive to constructive feedback, your thoughts of when you should provide one-on-one constructive feedback. Is it something that happens at the time that it happens, during your next follow-up on a one-on-one meeting, every quarter, every review time? Is there some right timing of getting constructive feedback?
This is a tough part of the call now, constructive feedback. But if you notice a trend with, at least with me, those little nuggets of checking in, showing that you care, when you do have to give that negative feedback, they know it comes from a place of you wanting to see them do better. It's not like I said before, if the only communication is during a weekly or biweekly one-on-one and the only thing you're doing is just hammering that individual with what they need to work on, that puts them in a tough spot mentally. But if you've done your check-ins and they know you're compassionate, you can give them some really tough feedback, and they know it will be tough for them to hear it, because it always is tough to hear negative feedback, but they know it comes from a place of compassion. I'm not a big person of giving negative feedback or constructive feedback over email or Slack, or whatever the internal communications are. I like to do it face to face on a video call like this, just because I feel like it comes off more compassionate and not just delivering difficult news. I think you should do it as soon as you can. It wouldn't be impactful for me to get constructive feedback 3 weeks after that constructive feedback was noticed. I would love to get both of your thoughts. They would want that as soon as possible. I just feel like it goes better if you can do it face to face. If you can't do it face to face, do it over a phone call. But I just would not do it over email, text, or Slack. But I'll pause for a second because I would love to get both of your feedback.
I'm curious. I'm going to jump in with a little bit of a side question, maybe. If you're only jumping on a call for constructive feedback, would you be afraid that somebody might think, oh no, JT said he wants to talk? Or do you also do one-to-one, face-to-face calls when people are not only need of some sort of constructive feedback?
That's really great. So at least for me, I always hop on calls with reps from, think of wrestling, tag team, right? Like you got Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin. They're trying to win the match. That's how I do it. If I notice things, we can debrief immediately after the call. So I never, ever want a rep or a team member to feel like I'm hopping on a call because I'm coming in there to grade them like a college professor, because that's not the case. Anytime I'm on a call, they know that, I feel like they're excited because they know that I'm on there, I'm going to be enthusiastic, and we're going to try to close the business. But they also know we're going to debrief after the call. And I may not have a ton of negative stuff. I'm going to have feedback. I think that's important. But I never want to set the foundation. A team member or a group of team members knows I'm going to be on a call and they're just like shaking in their boots, because I just think that's just a tough spot to put people in. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I'll kind of jump in. I think, JT, you're very unique in your leadership perspective. Have been the fan of giving constructive feedback in bunches, not doing it at the time, because similar to what Tevi has said, I've unfortunately in my career have had a bad experience of getting that feeling that every time I see my manager's name pop up in Slack, it's like, oh great, what did I do now? So I've always tried to use the sense of, if it's something that needs to be addressed now, address it now. If it's not, wait for 3-4 minor things that happen over a number of weeks and try to address them all at the same time. I'm a big believer in not going more than 10 days without giving someone an accommodation and giving them that positive feedback. So I hope if I'm regularly, on almost a weekly basis, giving them positive feedback, and every couple of weeks now coming with something constructive, it hopefully lands at home a little bit more. But most managers I've had in my career, it's very little on the positive, regular on the constructive, that it turns you off very much to even seeing their name pop up, whether it's a call, whether it's Slack. So that's why I've normally tried to go with that approach, but agree completely that constructive feedback always needs to be done live. And if you're in an office in person or remote, it needs to be done via video, never in text, never in Slack, because the door swings wide open for it to be interpreted in the totally wrong way, where you could be giving somebody, a 5 out of 10 type feedback, and they take it as a -5, reading something that you've written completely in a different direction, and then opening it up to a lot of more negative feelings. And when you're giving that constructive feedback, not always does somebody take it very well, or sometimes they can get upset or frustrated. What do you think are some things that you can do when somebody doesn't take the feedback?
That's a good question. I've got a 24-hour rule I like to implement. So even if I get feedback that I don't like, I think you've got to give it time to settle, and then you can address it after 24 hours, especially if it's something that is negative or maybe you don't agree with, because it's always good to self-reflect. I always ask that question too when I do have to give constructive feedback, because a lot of times That individual may be self-aware, or they may lack the self-awareness of what that feedback may be. It leads that conversation to be a little bit easier if they can self-reflect and they already know what I'm going to. That helps guide that conversation when it's going to be constructive feedback. And now it's a difficult conversation, but again, it's setting the expectation previous to our conversation earlier of I'm open to feedback. I need feedback. I'm going to give you feedback. But if, in the event that the feedback is something that maybe we don't agree on, can we agree to give it 24 hours before we come and talk through it? And we'll talk through it in a setting like we're doing right now via video or a phone. That would be how I would approach it. Would love to know your thoughts, Scott and Tevy.
So this is the return of the asynchronous marriage consultations I spoke about in the previous episode. Relationship advice like that works everywhere. When somebody does something, you can be on fire, and the natural thing is you just want to spit out the first thing that comes out of your mouth, get that feeling off of your chest. But I always try to, or at least I work to try to, that 24-hour period, like you said, here's what I feel, write the document down, wait till the next day. And half the time it's like scrapping it or scrapping most of it and doing something much more constructive. The first 24 hours is probably much more passionate. There's a lot more emotion being involved in that. Try to take the emotion out of it just to make sure the messaging is clear, make sure the communication is clear, and that you're coming from the heart. You're speaking from the heart and trying to give them the sense you're trying to do it for their benefit and to make it for the well-being.
So my background is in design, UX design and product design. So I've been receiving feedback for 20 years. And the first couple of years of my career, receiving feedback about a design from a client or a manager, a boss, was always difficult to accept, especially when it wasn't given in a constructive way. Like my favorite is what's a good one? It doesn't do it for me, or make it pop. Feedback that's not very meaningful to a designer. They don't know what to do with that. That's infuriating. So I learned to just accept the feedback and try to think of what they mean by it. What I started doing way back then was, what if I was giving the feedback? What if I said those words to another designer? What would I mean by it? How should I accept that? So that was a good way to flip it from my perspective. It's important to make sure you're giving feedback that is actually actionable and meaningful. And I know Reed Hastings, I just read his book a few weeks ago about Netflix's rules for how they give and receive feedback, and really good guidelines on how to create constructive feedback. They also say don't wait, do it right away, because the longer you wait to give feedback, then the longer that problem exists and you want to solve that problem. So one of the ways they do that is they say you'd be better at, or it'd be better for the company if, and then you give that feedback. So it's very actionable and very concrete. If somebody's upset and they come at me, then I would want to reiterate what the result was that I would want, or what it was that they did that needs fixing, and say, this is not a personal attack. Reinforce whatever it is they're doing that's good. Hopefully there's something that's good. And make sure that you try to take any emotion out of it and make sure that they see that this is actually well-intentioned and not meant to be.
I definitely agree with that. Those one-liners feedback you would get would have to be tough to hear. Make it pop.
It doesn't do it for me. I don't feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
that was fun. Good times. So pivoting a little bit, what would you do to somebody who's not meeting expectations? I know I said that hopefully someone is meeting expectations, so the constructive feedback is not going to be so harsh. But what if someone is not meeting expectations? How would you provide feedback around?
That's a good question. I think once you got to that point, you would have either had a ton of one-on-ones leading up to those micro conversations. I think a question to really help open up the conversation when someone is struggling is just to ask them to self-evaluate how they think they're doing in that role. That'll tell you a couple things. It'll tell you if they have the self-awareness to know that they need to get better. It may help guide the conversation because they may bring up all the talking points that you want to talk about, but for whatever reason they haven't. Both parties have missed being able to diagnose where the potential gaps are. Leading into another option would be just asking them if it's okay for you to give some very detailed feedback that you've observed over the course of time. In the sales world, we have data, right? We know how many calls they're making, what their close ratios are, how much revenue they brought in. These are all factual things that you can come back to, because I think when you give negative feedback, it has to be a combination of raw data and what you are observing. And I think it needs to be a healthy mix, because if it leans one way or the other, or only off how you feel about something, it's going to be tough, because we all do things differently, but we can end up at the end result, which is the goal. Tevi, I'm sure in your role, there's people that design and do things differently than maybe you would personally, but at the end of the day, they can get to the goal. So it's just making sure that whatever needs to happen to get to that end goal can align with the company's core value and mission statement, but still allowing that person to be themselves. Ultimately, when you have to have a combination of data and what you are seeing, and a healthy combination of both, they may not receive that information well, but they know it's not one-sided. So would love your feedback on that as well.
Yeah, you said was actually the biggest lesson that I had to learn when I first started managing people was people are going to do things differently than me, and it's about the outcome. Are they going to get the outcome that we need as a team, even though they do it differently? As long as they're still doing that and they're executing against the mission, let people be different. Let people be unique and solve problems in their own way. As far as responding to not meeting expectations, what I've done is first I provide very clear expectations. Let's say a product roadmap by next Monday. If they haven't been able to do that, or I follow up with them during the course of that week, what's our progress on that roadmap? By the time Monday comes, I'll know that either they're behind or what their progress is. But then I'll try to get smaller in terms of the expectation that I need. Or what's the roadmap? What's the next sprint looking like for this specific area? Make those smaller asks, which are usually easier for people to manage, especially if they're newer to the industry or newer to the company. How about you, Scott?
I don't think there's really much I can add into this. I like the idea of the self-evaluation. Let them speak first, give them the opportunity to give a sense of how they feel they're doing and how that aligns with you. And on the other side, I really like the idea of maybe the expectations weren't clear enough. That's why they're not meeting it, because they weren't clearly defined enough. And then especially for a junior person, maybe the expectations were a little bit too much, for their experience or for the role. Okay, how do you fine tune that and go more granular to make it easier for them to achieve? The one thing that I'm thinking about, and I think, JT, that you hit it on the head, it's across a company, is there really data that you can rely on across all teams? Sales, support are all based on data. Sales, revenues, support tickets. I think it's a lot easier to say here you're clearly hitting expectations or not. Well, obviously, with context, it's COVID and the world is burning down. It might not be the best time for selling anything, or it might not be the best time for responding to support tickets. But perhaps on a product team, is there as much data maybe around deliverable times, the expectation of this was supposed to be delivered by a certain date? Is there that same data that's available to be able to use to clearly communicate those expectations? Again, there's no revenue numbers, there's no support tickets. That's something that's on the top of my head of within a product team, a design team, or a marketing team. Is data always there, or is it something missing?
You always have to have a clear outcome, whether it's charted data that's instrumented within your product, or if it's like, we need to close 3 clients worth X monthly ARR. There's got to be something tangible that you could look at and say, this was the outcome you were hoping for, and we didn't get there. And that's what we're talking about.
JT, the last question, at least that I have, if you have some tips that you'd like to share and leave our audience about providing one-on-one feedback in a remote environment.
I think I've hit the nail on the head with this, but I would say the constant check-ins in between one-on-ones, having a healthy balance of constructive and positive feedback, because, contrary to popular belief, not everyone wants to hear that they're the best person at their job. People inherently want to get better. So being able to identify, even in top performers and whatever the role may be, areas that they can improve on. They want to hear that information. And ultimately, I don't think it's ever what you say, it's how you say it, how you deliver it, being very intentional and delivering it in a way that you would want to get it is always a good leading indicator of how you should deliver feedback, even if it is negative. I would say the 24-hour shot clock or whatever, if you're a sports analogy person, is always good, especially if you have to deliver it. But more importantly, if you are receiving it, Scott, I think you alluded to that as well. Just taking some time to process the information that you want to deliver or you have been given is always good. And then again, doing it in a video call setting or over the phone is always a good thing to do. So those would be my tips for up and coming managers or people that are seasoned in leadership, because we can always get better. But at the crux of it, it's being intentional. I think if you can be intentional and lead from your core, good things will happen. So that would be my takeaway for today. Would love to hear, Scott, Tevi, what you think.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I don't have much to add. Those are fantastic. Thank you.
I think you've nailed every point that I would bring up. If I were in a sales role, JT, I'd ask if you were hiring the exact type of leader that I would absolutely love to be working for, that focus on building relationships, leading from the heart, being connected, giving that positive feedback, that positive feeling, building that relationship.
Thank you so much, JT. Thanks for joining.